Welcome back to our read-through of the Gay Science. Big episode last time dealing with the death of God and the madman passage. Many of the sections we're going to look at today are sort of like dealing with the aftermath of the insights in that passage. So let's begin with 132. Quote, "Against Christianity, what is now decisive against Christianity is our taste, no longer our reasons." End quote. That's one of those passages that's not very philosophically fecund. It's all right there in the face of it. The meaning's pretty clear, but it tells us something about Nietzsche that will be kind of my only comment on this. Remember the passage in Ecce Homo where he says that his taste decides against any gross answer, and God is a gross answer, an indelicacy against us thinkers. That's in the very first section of Why I Am So Clever. And there's an aspect of this declaration that Nietzsche takes these positions fundamentally because of his taste. There's an aspect of that points us back to the instincts, to the drives, as the source of valuations, rather than a neutral intellect that rationally evaluates claims and rationally determines their truth and falsehood. If you make it a matter of taste, as the saying goes, there's no accounting for taste. When we speak of something being in good or bad taste, that isn't really a rational evaluation. It's an evaluation of something aesthetic, because the aesthetic life isn't just about visual or auditory sensations. It's about the whole world of sensations. And, taste, it's obviously a metaphor extrapolated from one of our senses. Whether something tastes good or not, it's not a syllogism, right? It's an immediate, and that is to say unmediated experience, frankly, of just pleasure or displeasure. And so the Christian answer to the question is displeasing to us thinkers. And so now that's what's decisive in the current age against Christianity. It's the bad way it tastes, to put it bluntly. So let's move on now to 133. Quote, "Principle, an inescapable hypothesis to which humanity must have recourse again and again, is more powerful in the long run than the most firmly believed faith in an untruth. The Christian faith, for example. In the long run, that means in this context, 100,000 years." End quote. This one's interesting because, in a way, it seems to pull in the complete opposite direction from the previous aphorism, because here we speak of an inescapable hypothesis. In other words, we're talking about positing explanations for a phenomenon, and an explanation that we return to again and again that seems to actually, or to continually have explanatory power. That's more powerful than an untruth that inspires faith. And this would therefore seem to say that Nietzsche trusts in the intellect to decide against Christianity, if not in the short term, in the extreme long term of 100,000 years, which is quite different from our taste deciding. I think one thing to notice is that when he says our in 132, the previous aphorism, he may not mean humanity generally, whereas in 133, I think he definitely means humanity generally. So for us philosophers and free spirits, our taste decides. For the rest of humanity, they may have to learn the lesson of what happens when you place your faith in an untruth, butting up against a hard reality again and again until they finally learn the hard way to affirm the inescapable hypothesis. Whether this is theory of evolution, dangers of the Christian value system towards life itself, hazards of attempting to live by means of the theoretical approach to life. We might say that every attempt to set up a new all-encompassing ideal to govern human life, all of those attempts, especially the ones that were risked in the 20th century, whether communism or fascism or even managerial capitalism or whatever, that all traces back to that same Platonic desire to run the world as a stable system, to fix humanity, to fix the intractable questions of governance. And, maybe every time the system comes apart at the seams and we proverbially bash our head against the wall, we're learning the folly of that theoretical approach to politics. And that's a very broad, maybe it's even a terribly oversimplified point, but I hope my meaning is clear. The main target in this passage is once again Christianity, as he says, And that's his example of a firmly held faith in an untruth. So it's actually a very hopeful passage because Christianity is far more ingrained in the European mind than any of the recent experiments that we've run, for example, in new political theories or something like that. So it's a hopeful passage, right? It's a kind of sentiment that people rarely associate with Nietzsche, that truth will win out eventually. And I'm not sure that this sentiment actually really can be said to carry through to the end of his work. It might be sort of a last gasp of Nietzsche's, we might say, flirtation with Enlightenment rationalism. Always critically, by the way. People present the so-called Free Spirit trilogy. Those are the books from Human All Too Human through The Gay Science, so including Human All Too Human, Book 1, 2, Wanderer and His Shadow, Daybreak, and the first 4 books of The Gay Science, all those books leading up to Zarathustra. Sometimes it's sort of said that they're all, products of Nietzsche's humanism, or that they're involved more with his influence of the French aphorists, and that he is more flirting with Enlightenment rationalism, as I've said. I do think people tend to oversimplify that because some of his most reactionary and most irrationalist and most romantic sentiments actually occur in these texts. He doesn't really spend as much time talking about politics really at all as he does in Human All Too Human. So there's caveats to that. And there might even be an insight there about how when he's leveling those most romantic sentiments, it's counterbalanced with the most reverence for the rationalism of the Enlightenment, which is kind of funny. And maybe, if I could be offensively Hegelian, maybe he sublates that later. But anyway, this is apparently an optimistic sentiment, just to return to the context of just this passage. So let's go to 134, where Nietzsche addresses the pessimists. Quote, "Pessimists as victims. Wherever a deep discontent with existence becomes prevalent, it is the after effects of some great dietary mistake made by a whole people over a long period of time that are coming to light. Thus the spread of Buddhism, not its origin, depended heavily on the excessive and almost exclusive reliance of the Indians on rice, which led to a general loss of vigor. Perhaps the modern European discontent is due to the fact that our forefathers were given to drinking through the entire Middle Ages, thanks to the effects on Europe of the Teutonic taste. The German discontent with life is essentially a winter sickness that is worsened by the effects of stuffy cellar air and the poison of stove fumes in German living rooms." End quote. The really important thing in this passage, aside from any specific claim about what made the Germans discontented with life, whether it's generations of drinking or stuffy cellar air or stove fumes, all of which, you might consider that to be spurious explanations. The important thing is that Nietzsche is looking for a physiological origin for pessimism. So that's number one. That's the experiment he's making throughout much of his work, but particularly in this book. Passages like this one are Nietzsche's attempt at posing the hypothesis. Perhaps the modern European discomfort is due to the effects of Teutonic drinking. The Teutonic taste for drinking that has infected all Europe. So to explain this, Nietzsche considered alcohol to be kind of, like a poison. And really he thought it's like, repeated alcohol intake as a regular recreational activity. You're sort of steadily poisoning yourself. In a way, Nietzsche would have said that drinking is, the way that Marx said that the opiate, that religion is the opiate of the masses, Nietzsche would have said maybe like drinking is sort of like the salve or the balm of the Germans. And then, of course, of European Christendom more broadly. Now, obviously, he had a more positive view of like Greek rituals that involved wine, but the Greeks weren't getting drunk regularly. They would drink for these religious rituals on special occasions. Usually they're drinking mixed wine. It was watered down. It was meant to purify your drinking water in a way, rather than make you intoxicated. The Germans drink as a national pastime, and that drinking's always kind of gone hand in hand with the Christian religion. I remember when I was in Munich, I learned that the Pope had to put a limit on how much beer the monks could drink during the time of fasting, because they were stumbling around the monasteries drunk, just drinking gallons and gallons of beer, because it makes you feel full, and it's a fun way to pass the time during a fast. And Catholics always like to impose these fasts upon themselves and then have little loopholes. But so why does Nietzsche say the Germans are a people full of discontent? Well, the last major German event was Luther. In some way, Luther is one of the main elements that brings us into modernity. The modern age begins with Luther, among other things. There's that quote from Thomas Carlyle that the three aspects of the modern age are Protestantism, gunpowder, and the printing press. And those are three things Nietzsche also would identify as definitive of the modern age. Now, in any case, Luther can be seen as a representative of the German obsession with purifying things. The Germans have purity laws for their beers. The Protestant Reformation was an attempt to purify the religion. If you're a rationalistic, cold, calculating northerner, as Nietzsche might characterize Northern Europeans, you don't like all these concessions that the religion has to make, that the religion has to sort of concede to human imperfection or human nature. You don't like the ambiguity. You don't like the wiggle room. There's always some way for the system to become more coherent, more rational. In this case, we're talking about your theological system. And you could even see this attitude in Germany as like a cultural trait up to this day, that I don't think Nietzsche is just entirely like speaking to something that is in the past, so to speak. I mean, like the German exactitude when it comes to like industry and, like the Germans make the best machinery in the world, right? Maybe it's out of that ethos. But one could comment on the overall German attitude towards life, that they're known for, being a serious, strict, and even humorless people. And I think that's the nature of German discontent. There might be another reference here to Schopenhauer. Obviously, Schopenhauer is not definitive of the German culture as a whole. But I think Nietzsche sometimes uses him this way because Schopenhauer's pessimism is like, in its essence, it's very German. And one can see Schopenhauer as a natural endpoint to Kant's project. And at least Nietzsche would have seen him that way. And maybe the most interesting point that Kaufman makes in his commentary as to why the Germans are this way and why Nietzsche would make that remark about the poison of stove fumes and stuffy air, the Germans have to spend their winters indoors. So this isn't just we're not saying it's like a biological trait of Northerners that they happen to be this way. They stay cooped up for many months of the year, for most of the day during those months, huddled by the fire, for warmth. And this kind of sedentary existence, at least for a significant chunk of the year, perhaps has a long-term effect on what kind of people they are. It makes them heavy spiritually. It makes them ponderous, right? Everything about the Germans is sort of like that. The spirit of gravity, right? Slow, stagnant, self-serious. Whereas Nietzsche spent his winter months outdoors, at least way more than your average German did. I mean, he traveled around so he could do this, but, he still went out for his walks with regularity during pretty much all months of the year. And, even the fact that Nietzsche moved around and spent his winters in the south of Europe, I think says something about Nietzsche and his sort of like opposition to the Germans. There are many comments also. I want to bring up another aspect of this passage. There are many comments throughout the Gay Science. I think a total of 3 aphorisms where Nietzsche brings up the rice-based diet of the East. And sometimes speaking of the Chinese, sometimes of the Indians, to explain their religious beliefs or their worldview. And again, we might question, is there really a direct link? Is it literally true on a physiological level that eating rice leads to Buddhism, right? But it is interesting, 2 things. For one, Nietzsche says this accounts for the spread of Buddhism, but not its origin, which means Gautama Buddha, much like Jesus Christ, is very different as a type from the ones who would follow him. And Nietzsche still regards Buddhism on the balance as a pessimistic religion, as a religion that, it wearies of the world. And yet he evaluates Buddha as being a much more noble individual, at least more noble than the rank and file monks in the centuries and millennia who adopt his religion. And then second, the other thing is that we might note that Buddhism actually makes it does actually make it a tenet of their religion to be vegetarian. And many of the monks do only eat rice if possible. I mean, it's a staple of the diet in that part of the world. So there's not really anything special about rice. If Buddha had, lived in Europe, he would have said just eat bread, right? But Buddhism, the monks only eat what people leave in their begging bowl. And so on the scale of fasting to feasting, feasting generally being more of a trait of the pagan world, and fasting being generally more something we would associate with Christianity in a Western context, Buddhism is much closer to fasting. And the Buddhists say, no, it's the middle way between hedonism and asceticism. Okay, if it's in the middle between the two, it's still on the side of asceticism, right? It's not self-torture in the Christian way, but it does demand this suppression of impulse. And basically the only impulses you're kind of allowed to follow are the ones that facilitate your survival. You're not following them because you're following your impulses, right? You're making a conscious choice to eat. You can control how much you indulge in an impulse or not. And so whether we blame the spread of Buddhism on a decline of vitality, spread by those who adhere to it, taking in a bare minimum of nutrients or something like that, and thus becoming world-weary, if there is that direct link, I mean, we have to notice that the Buddhist religion spreads the practice of taking in a bare minimum of nutrients. It's part of their ascetic ideal. And one wonders whether the religion in some unconscious way, like the religion, the ideology, quote unquote, knows, or the adherents know on some instinctive level that this is a way of maintaining itself. That asceticism, as regards one's diet, promotes an ascetic view of the world. And these are all very complicated questions that honestly I think are better explored through scientific inquiry. We can only go so far with philosophical speculation, but it's interesting that Nietzsche is at least experimentally thinking in these terms of diet as determinative of worldview. And there is at least some evidence to back this up, at least at the most basic level, or that, like, on the level of the individual, right? That a bad diet can make you depressed, and fresh air and exercise can improve your mood. So, I mean, it should literally affect your mindset, your attitude, maybe even your worldview when you're cooped up in the winter months for all this time and breathing in these stove fumes and breathing in all this stuffy air, and that's your reality. Yeah, I think that's a plausible hypothesis. Nietzsche seems to say that repeating these physiological inputs over generations has some effect on the population suggested to it, which I think is also a plausible hypothesis. I mean, North Koreans are on average, like a foot shorter than South Koreans because of their relative lack of nutrients. Same people, genetically. So one wonders, has that had an effect maybe on their temperament, the average character of a North Korean, even in the span of, 60, 70 years? And even though we've come to understand much of this a lot better, there's still just major debates in nutritional science, and there's just so much we don't understand about it. And, as a final comment, then I would say to call to mind that passage we looked at a couple episodes previously in Book 3 of The Gay Science. Every person has their own health, their own diet, their own needs, even their own poisons or their own course of disease. We've been too universalist in our approach to these issues. Let's go to 135, quote, "Origin of sin. Sin, as it is now experienced wherever Christianity holds sway or has held sway, is a Jewish feeling and a Jewish invention. Regarding this background of all Christian morality, Christianity did aim to Judaize the world. How far it has succeeded in Europe is brought about by the fact that Greek antiquity, a world without feelings of sin, still seems so very strange to our sensibility, although whole generations, as well as many excellent individuals, have expended so much goodwill on attempts to approach and incorporate this world. Only if you repent will God show you grace. That would strike a Greek as ridiculous and annoying. He would say, maybe slaves feel that way. The Christian presupposes a powerful, overpowering being who enjoys revenge. His power is so great that nobody could possibly harm him except for his honor. Every sin is a slight to his honor, a crimen lese majestatis divinae, and no more. Contrition, degradation, rolling in the dust, all this is the first and last condition of his grace, in sum the restoration of his divine honor. Whether the sin has done any other harm, whether it has set in motion some profound calamity that will grow and seize one person after another like a disease and strangle them, this honor-craving Oriental in heaven could not care less. Sin is an offense against him, not against humanity. Those who are granted his grace are also granted this carelessness regarding the natural consequences of sin. God and humanity are separated so completely that a sin against humanity is really unthinkable. Every deed is to be considered solely with respect to its supernatural consequences, without regard for its natural consequences. That is what Jewish feeling demands, for whatever is natural is considered ignoble. The Greeks, on the other hand, were rather closer to the notion that sacrilege, too, might have some nobility. Even theft, as in the case of Prometheus, even the slaughter of cattle as the expression of insane envy, as in the case of Ajax. And in their desire to invent some dignity for sacrilege and to incorporate nobility in it, they invented tragedy, an art form and a pleasure that have remained essentially and profoundly foreign to the Jew, in spite of all his poetic gifts and his sense for the sublime." End quote. So, first things first, historical fact, Christianity comes from the Jewish religion. Many interpreters, Kaufman included, are uncomfortable with Nietzsche using language like Judaized. But even if this is put in terms that we would find offensive in modernity, Nietzsche's making a real point based on that, again, historical fact, when he says the Jewish religion finds everything natural ignoble. It's a priestly religion par excellence, because it legislates a very comprehensive system of rules to govern almost every aspect of human life. And that's for the sake of God, right? So from sexuality to warfare to eating and drinking to when you can work, what trades you can do, how to slaughter your animals, what fabrics you can wear. This is all in the Old Testament, rules for all of this. And some Jews, like Orthodox Jews, like the Hasidim, still observe these regulations to this day. Even some Christians who interpret Jesus' words that he's not here to abolish the old law make an attempt to observe these rules, or in some of these rules. The important thing is that none of this is for the benefit of mankind. These are the laws of Yahweh. You observe them because you have a covenant with Yahweh. So it's something you owe to Yahweh to observe these things. It's not, you don't observe them for philanthropic reasons. Now, I understand you can make the argument that indirectly it is, because the most beneficial thing is to be in the good graces of Yahweh, but we'll leave that aside. And I mean, just the general claim of priestliness, I guess, I would also point out it's not uncommon among the Orthodox Jews to hold that the Jewish people are the priests of the world, and the Orthodox are sort of like the priests among the priests. And, what Nietzsche says about the ascetic ideal and the figure of the priest is very fascinating here, because the priesthood in every culture and every age is established based on rules of hygiene. This is something he talks about in Genealogy. That he says originally these were very literal rules, very concrete. The priest was quite literally a cleaner individual than the average person. So, right, they didn't handle money. They didn't sleep with women. They didn't eat impure foods. They didn't wear these mixed fabrics. So every such practice or observance was supposed to keep them pure, whether this purity is real or imagined. So, for example, the observance of not eating pork. Some historians have theorized that this may have been adopted by the Jewish people in the Levant, among other groups, as a way of drawing a distinction between themselves and everyone else who did eat it. So those restrictions might not literally make you cleaner or holier or whatever, but it's another way to distinguish yourself from others. And that's the whole basis of how the ascetic, for Nietzsche, draws a line around itself, around the priestly caste, and creates or establishes its own pathos of distance. The way that the warrior aristocracies do, but they establish it on the basis of these metaphysical moral beliefs. So that's the priestly method of sort of setting the priestly classes, or the ascetic castes, or whatever we want to call them, setting themselves above the rest of the populace. And on the one hand, there's something about that represents Well, as Nietzsche says and Schopenhauer as educator, it's a great leap from animal to something purely human. The priest is one such road to the elevation of man because he represents the domination of oneself and one's own instincts through will. And that's always what impressed the warrior nobility and caused them to treat the priestly classes with a kind of reverence. Again, speaking here in kind of general terms. The downside of this is that the ascetic way of life, the ascetic way of dominating or suppressing the instincts, proceeds by extirpation. Nietzsche also, there's many words we could use for this. Castration, emasculation. He talks about their attempt to destroy the drive utterly. So this way of handling the instincts or the impulses, of suppressing them, accordingly tends to, well, it denigrates the body and it denigrates nature. It also exhausts the drives because, in truth, an impulse, you can't just voluntarily not discharge an impulse. It either gets discharged externally or it gets sublimated, or a stronger impulse has to come in and hold that impulse in check, right? Nietzsche says it's not our reason that's sort of arbitrarily deciding which impulses to indulge. When one impulse triumphs over another, it calls reason to its aid to sort of make a post hoc rationalization. And so what's really happening is that the cruelty directed inward that creates the ascetic ideal, that cruel impulse is what's holding the other impulses sort of making war. It's that impulse. The priest nourishes that impulse, which gives him the highest feeling of power, which is really, it's synonymous in many ways with the guilt and bad conscience, but uses that to basically make war on the other impulses. And what this does is it sort of creates this inner-directed world that exhausts what little energy the impulses have left. And so the priest is a leap beyond nature to something more than animal, but the priest becomes like an anti-animal, right? The anti-natural type. So the priest doesn't overcome humanity in that way. Nietzsche thinks the priest is sort of a dead end. It's an exemplar of man's elevation, but that specific path doesn't lead anywhere. So what Nietzsche is pointing out is not just the historical origins of Christianity coming out of Judea and Jesus, preaching to the Jews, and the understanding that Christians have of Jesus as fulfilling the prophecies of the Torah. What's important here is that the priestly ideal that defines their society is apotheosized in Christianity. Whatever the physiological origins of the ascetic ideal or the priestly mode of existence. Because not everyone in the Jewish culture is an ascetic, per se, right? But they all follow these religious laws. The priestly conception of sin is as an offense against God, an offense against God's law, against heaven, against the other world, not against human beings. That conception of sin, so central to Christianity, is what Jesus apotheosizes. So this whole life, all of it's for Yahweh, not for us. I've heard a Christian YouTuber, he's like a Protestant guy who goes and talks to people from other Christian sects. I remember I was watching him talk about his own conversion story and just journey through the faith, and he said it was a great insight for him when he realized the main character of the Bible, the protagonist of the Bible, is not me. It's not humanity even. It's God, right? God's the main character. And that's very elucidating about the nature of this story. And so maybe a different ideal from the Greek world, we might say when Zeus mandates that all should have a share of justice, all men should have the capacity to be just, that is for the benefit of mankind. That's for their sake. It's so their cities can function and men can live with one another in close proximity. Now, Jesus comes and he forgives the sins of mankind, but in the Christian doctrine, that doesn't mean you go on sinning willy-nilly. You have to ask for forgiveness and try to stop sinning, right? So people no longer need to do these animal sacrifices or observe every last detail of the law, but now there's this regime of guilt and forgiveness that's established in the psyche. And it comes out of that old priestly valuation that all observances of the law are for the sake of God. Its violations are a transgression against him. We no longer do these rituals to purify ourselves or cast out scapegoats. Now we ask for forgiveness, but that fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. And in Christianity, it's actually far worse because, as Nietzsche says, contrition, degradation, rolling in the dust. Nowhere are these more pronounced than in Christianity. I mean, and we might think of Pascal and his sect, the Jansenists. They were obsessed with the idea of contrition, constantly prostrating themselves in penance to God, constantly in a state of remorse and begging God's forgiveness. And, I mean, not unlike Buddhist ascetics, they isolate themselves from society, they live simply, they live a Spartan existence. They tried to reduce any enjoyment of those worldly pleasures or desires, to focus all of their attention, right, on the other world. And, it's worth noting, Jesus says he came to forgive sins. He alone has the power to forgive sins. And I would say in ordinary life, most of us believe that the one actually who has the right and the responsibility to forgive trespasses that's the one who's actually trespassed against, right? And Christ calls his followers, forgive those who trespass against you. But in the final analysis, right, as regards the fate of your soul, it only matters whether Christ does the forgiving. Whether I forgive someone for harming me or not, the thing that matters is that Christ forgives them, that God forgives them. And the interesting thing, the way Nietzsche describes God in the Christian imagination is as a powerful, overpowering being who enjoys revenge. His power is so great that no one can harm him, only his honor. And there's an element of this, you could say it's standard Reddit atheist critique of the absurd immorality of the Christian moral suppositions. But there's a deeper philosophical point here that this is why sin is layered on top of the world of suffering. It doesn't actually involve itself with the material world or the social world around us. It's not really an ethical concern as regards other human beings. It's all superordinate to ethics. It's all superordinate over the phenomenal world. In practice, the whole doctrine of sin becomes rather self-absorbed, entirely contained within your own mind. Now, I know many Christians do not entirely contain it within their own mind, and they're very concerned about the sins of others. But that's the funny thing. It's like Nietzsche saying, true Christianity, true penitent, contrite Christianity would actually be self-absorbed in that way, right? God's got it. All you need to worry about is getting your sins forgiven. That's the only thing you have control over. And it's not for nothing that the way God is imagined is very much like an exaggerated caricature of the so-called evil Greek or evil Roman that the early Christians despised. It's like a super version of the domineering warrior aristocrat. Now it's so powerful, it's beyond imagination, and he's on my side, the weak slave, right? So long as I repent. And that's why Nietzsche says a Greek would have found this proposition ridiculous. It would have stirred his anger to hear, you have to repent. And he would have said, well, okay, the slaves think that way, right? So Christianity superimposes the ultimate master onto the universe for you to be a willing slave of. And it makes your slavery to that master actually laudable, right? So it's considerations like this, the contrast between the Jewish and later Christian morality with the Greek, and the implicit invocation of a different morality for master and slave that, by the way, prefigures the dichotomy that appears in the genealogy. The main counterpoint that Nietzsche raises at the end is something we've discussed quite a bit in the past. The noble man does not sin in the Greek religious mindset. He maybe transgresses, maybe he transgresses even against the gods, but there's something admirable in that case in the transgressing, as opposed to the Jewish or the Christian morality, where transgressing is not honored in any way. Your obedience is what is honored. And Nietzsche raises that as early as Birth of Tragedy, and the difference between the Prometheus story and the Adam and Eve story. The comparison he makes is that in the Genesis myth, sin is committed secretively, something Eve is seduced into doing in a way, or convinced into doing. She then sort of seduces or convinces Adam over to sin. They do it kind of deceptively and naively or thoughtlessly. And that's the whole basis of original sin, right? Prometheus clashes with the gods. Prometheus has a different clashing perspective from the Olympians. He sees the great potential in mankind. He actively defies Zeus. And so he has a consciously articulated different perspective, so it's not thoughtless. And he steals the fire as a sort of affirmative decision that no one else has to sort of seduce him to, and he owns that decision. As Nietzsche puts it in Birth of Tragedy, it's a more masculine story of sin. And the Greeks celebrated this. They commemorated what happens to Prometheus in their tragedies. So as if Prometheus is a hero and his downfall is tragic. From the perspective of the Jewish religion, or the Christian for that matter, which is that apotheosis of the idea of sin, which is very central to Judaism, but it's taken to these crazy heights in Christianity and abstracted out of that original ethno-political socio-context or whatever of the law. From that perspective of sin, it's almost impossible to conceive of a story where someone sins and it's good. That's why Goethe's Faust is so subversive. It's such an amazing literary work, in my opinion. But we don't need to get into that. That would take us too far afield. I think just one final comparison then to make, which comes to mind, thinking of Faust, if we compare Prometheus to Lucifer, Lucifer's undeniably bad in the Christian understanding. There's no saving grace. There's no ambiguity with Lucifer. But Prometheus is a rather similar figure in many respects. I mean, he defies the highest divinity because he has his own plans for the world. He has his own plans for mankind. In the Greek world, Prometheus is a tragic hero. In the Christian world, Lucifer is a source of all evil, unambiguous evil. So just the way that they look at rebellion. But again, the broader point is that all the evil in the world is rebellion against God. There's nothing concerned with humanity about it. It's totally anti-natural, otherworldly. And everything good is obedience to that anti-natural, otherworldly principle. That's the critique that Nietzsche's making of Christianity, again, using the Greek religion as a counterpoint to elucidate that contrast. Let's go on to 136, quote, "The chosen people, the Jews, who feel that they are the chosen people among all nations, because they are the moral genius among the nations, because they had a more profound contempt for the human being in themselves than any other people, the Jews' enjoyment of their divine monarch and saint is similar to that which the French nobility derived from Louis XIV. This nobility had surrendered all of its power and sovereignty and had become contemptible. In order not to feel this, in order to be able to forget this, one required royal splendor, royal authority, plenitude of power without equal, to which only the nobility had access. By virtue of this privilege, one rose to the height of the court, and from that vantage point one saw everything beneath oneself and found it contemptible, and thus one got over an irritable conscience. Thus the tower of the royal power was built ever higher into the clouds, and one did not hold back even the last remaining stones of one's own power." End quote. So the Jews are the chosen people among all nations for the reasons we discussed before. We're the priests of all the world. It's a very widely known religious belief of theirs. They alone lived according to God's law, that anti-natural contempt for things worldly. That's what Nietzsche is here calling a contempt for the human being in themselves, which, by the way, anything he can say about the Jews in this passage is like 10 times true of Christianity. So does Pascal have contempt for the human being in himself? Absolutely. So now, but Nietzsche says because of this, they had an enjoyment for their divine monarch and saint, which is a bit ambiguous, actually, because it could simply refer to like the idea of the Messiah, the savior of their people, prophesied savior of their people, a divine king, right? Or it could refer to the historical Jesus, who gathered Jews among his early followers. After all, Jesus is king of the Jews, but he's called that by the Christians. And I personally think Nietzsche is talking about Jesus here, but it is a little ambiguous. The comparison he draws is to Louis XIV. So he ended the period of strong aristocracy, the feudal system of France, that if we remember, Machiavelli says the feudal system of France made it impossible to invade or very difficult to take over, very difficult to conquer, because there's all these independent centers of power. Louis consolidates power in a conflict, or over the course of a conflict called the Fronde, and he defeats the princes and the nobles and the parlements. And he ushers in, it's an era of centralized monarchy, basically. And Nietzsche attributes this to the fact that the aristocracy previous to this had surrendered all their power. They became contemptible. In other words, they disgraced themselves. They were unworthy of their power. And it's for that reason that when one of them, rises above the others, when Louis XIV ascends the throne, he looks down on the nobles, sees that they're all disgraceful. He therefore subdues them with a good conscience, right? He gets over an irritable conscience. There's also the implication that their very inner state of feeling contemptible might summon the urge to create a royal authority, right? In any case, the comparison here is to the Messiah or to the historical Jesus. I'm going to be honest, I don't like this passage because I don't buy either explanation. So the analogy doesn't work on any level for me. I don't buy that the reason for the Fronde and for Louis XIV's victory is because the aristocracy had surrendered their rights, because they quite literally didn't do that until after they'd lost. The Fronde was the nobles. It was like their last attempt to assert their rights. And it began as a challenge for Louis to, it was a challenge over his ability to levy taxes or something like that. All these, you have these massive historical forces or factors, working up to this decisive moment. And then it's always, what else would it be other than tax policy, right? That's what it always is, something stupid like that. But the nobles raised armies to contest that point and to impose a limit on the king's power. That was their struggle. And I would see that struggle as following a pattern that occurs many times throughout history of an autocrat versus the pre-existing oligarchy. They're actually always in tension with one another. And Nietzsche makes that point. Many ancient writers make that point. Mickles makes that point. George Orwell makes that point. So anyway, it's not clear to me that the nobility failed to be worthy of their power before the Fronde. It seems like the war was it was like the very test of that proposition. And furthermore, I don't buy the argument that the Jewish religion made its adherents feel so contemptible that it necessitated the royal splendor of a Messiah, like a son of God. Like if this does refer to Jesus. I don't buy that as an explanation for early Christianity. And probably not for the reasons that you might think. The main reason I don't buy it is because Christianity did not spread as successfully among Jews as it did among Greeks. And among, it really takes off in the Anatolian Peninsula and in Egypt and other parts of Africa and among the broader Roman underclass. But Christianity didn't exactly take the Jewish world by storm because they already had a religion, which is still around today, right? So it took the world of the dispossessed by storm, but not the Jewish people specifically. I think that's kind of we imagine that it was founded by the Jews and then it spread through the Jewish world. Really, it spread through the Greco-Roman, Hellenized Roman world. So I think this is kind of I'm not very into this aphorism. I will say there might be some cheeky kind of ironic thing that Nietzsche's saying there about the Tower of Babel, maybe. That there might be something there, that the Messiah, let me just read the line again at the end. Quote, "The tower of royal power was built ever higher into the clouds. One did not hold back even the last remaining stones of one's own power," end quote. So there might be something there, sort of irreverently comparing the amount of reverence given to Jesus to building up a Tower of Babel. But anyway, overall, I'm not a fan of this aphorism, but in the interest of fairness, I'm going to read one of Kaufman's points that he says this invites comparison to Feuerbach's argument that, quote, "Man strips himself of all virtue to endow God with it," end quote. And Kaufman continues, quote, "This is an immensely fruitful suggestion, but much more applicable to Martin Luther than to the Hebrew prophets," end quote. And a fair point. Maybe Nietzsche is directionally correct, as they say these days. There's a kind of psychological compensation that, similar to that dynamic we described earlier with God as the imagined all-powerful master, whom it's laudable to be a slave of, that would appeal precisely to the slave. I just think, as a real world example of that happening in political life, Louis XIV is a bad example. I just think it's a rare L for Nietzsche. Still interesting in some ways, though, even when his insights are a bit strained. Let's go to 137, quote, "Speaking in a parable, a Jesus Christ was possible only in a Jewish landscape. I mean one over which the gloomy and sublime thundercloud of the wrathful Jehovah was brooding continually. Only here was the rare and sudden piercing of the gruesome and perpetual general day-night by a single ray of the sun experienced as if it were a miracle of love, and the ray of unmerited grace. Only here could Jesus dream of his rainbow and his ladder to heaven on which God descended to man. Everywhere else good weather and sunshine were considered the rule in everyday occurrences." End quote. This is another aphorism that Nietzsche seems to be fixated right now on psychological compensation. So in 135, we have the idea that a people so thoroughly inculcated with slave morality, the otherworldly morality of the priest class, necessitate a master archetype for their god. Then in 136, the idea that a people as internalized self-contempt necessitate a figure, like a ruling figure of supreme splendor, to which you can attribute all your glory, have a receptacle for your pride, your self-respect. And then here we have this idea of, a people who, they're gloomy and pessimistic. They believe in this wrathful deity, Yahweh, and that necessitates a savior who's totally gracious and forgiving. And so, Nietzsche uses the metaphor if Yahweh is that blackest of nights, Jesus is that ray of sunshine. Well, the rest of antiquity, they're of the opinion life's pretty good. There might be some bloodshed and suffering and disease and death, but good weather and sunshine are the rule around here, man. It's only that in a nation of pessimists that you need a Jesus Christ. And I have to say again, I don't know if I find this particularly plausible. These last three passages in some way may be evidence of like a kind of dialectical hangover, because it reminds me of how Nietzsche describes the salvation offered by Greek tragedy, or the justification for life offered by Greek tragedy, back in Birth of Tragedy, obviously. The passage it reminds me of is the one where Nietzsche says that, you sort of like you stare into the, when you look into the moral universe of these tragedies, it's like staring into the sun. You stare into the bright sun and dark spots form in your eyes as a kind of compensation. Whereas if you gaze into Greek tragedy, it's like gazing into the abyss. It's staring at like a darkness that's piercing, a piercing darkness. The Sophoclean hero, he says, is like a bright spot that forms in the eyes as compensation. It's like a blessing for confronting the stark and the gloomy reality of human life, right? So you look at the sun, you get black spots in your eyes. You stare into the abyss. You get bright spots in your eyes, right? This is an insight that I think at least bears a resemblance to dialectics, that the extremes of one side of a polarity bring about the opposite, the negation, and that actually precisely at the point of greatest extremity of one side of the duality, that's the moment where the other side of the duality asserts itself. And so I think the contrast he provided for us a few sections earlier between the Greek worldview and the Christian worldview, that was of real value and prefigures the genealogy, which is, I would say, anti-dialectical. But I think he's on a bit of a dialectical kick here, and I think these points are a bit weaker for that, even though the poetry of what Nietzsche's saying here, I think, is of merit. It's a good image. Let's go to 138, where this is still the case, and I think, again, the poetry of what he's saying is very good, and things pick back up again with a more fascinating insight. Quote, "Christ's error. The founder of Christianity thought there was nothing of which men suffered more than their sins. That was his error, the error of one who felt that he was without sin and who lacked first-hand experience. Thus his soul grew full of that wonderful and fantastic compassion for a misery that even among his people who had invented sin was rarely a very great misery. But the Christians have found a way of vindicating their master since then and of sanctifying his error by making it, quote-unquote, come true," end quote. So, once again, it's only in the soul who feels he is without sin that you would develop that opposite polarity of sin is the most important thing in the world. And so all embracing compassion for all the sinners of the world. Again, this implicitly treats Jesus as not a divine person, as just a human being, right? That you can psychoanalyze, right? Forbidden, right? But not so much anymore, but definitely in Nietzsche's time, doing that with Jesus was not appropriate. So basically he has compassion for all this misery that he doesn't know, that he can only imagine, and that made it seem far worse to him. And there's a real point there, because the miseries we only imagine seem far worse. It's often the fear of experiencing something that, like the fantasy of experiencing it, or the nightmare of experiencing something that is a cause of a great deal of suffering, without weighing in on whether it causes more suffering or not. But so aside from that, though, that's the beginning of this psychological profile that Nietzsche eventually produces in The Antichrist. His view of Jesus is as a man with like a unique psychology in a way that's very different from his followers. In some way, the antithesis of his followers. For Jesus, the ultimate terror and misery is sin, because in Nietzsche's interpretation, Jesus doesn't suffer the way the rest of us do. He lives in that immediate reality of the kingdom of heaven. He's an immanentist in Nietzsche's interpretation. The kingdom of God is within you. And that's the reality that he actually experienced, a denial of the material world. Nietzsche describes Jesus as kind of like, to use a vulgar example, he's like Neo after he perceives the Matrix for what it really is, right? Jesus sees through the simulation. Now, that doesn't mean Nietzsche thinks reality is a simulation. He thinks that, in fact, Jesus is pathological. But the point is that Jesus lives in the denial of the world, in denial of his own suffering. He doesn't resist his torture and death. He doesn't resist his own martyrdom. And why is that? Because he feels, again, the kingdom of God, that's the real reality. What happens in this world, in this false world, including your own martyrdom, that's all, in some sense, false, right? So the worst thing, then, is not the worldly suffering. It's spiritual suffering. And Nietzsche says, in fact, the suffering that people actually felt from sinning in the Jewish religion is rarely a great misery, but Jesus treated it as the most important thing. And Christianity comes along. The later Christians vindicate their master by actually suffering from their sins far more profoundly than the Jews ever did. And so, again, I feel like I'm caught in this loop of constantly bringing up the Abigail Thorne video of, because people keep commenting on it, and bringing that up to me and talking about it. But, any criticism Nietzsche made of, quote unquote, the Jews applies 100 times to Christianity. And at the end of the day, it's not really about the Jews in the modern day, like as people. It's about, again, this historical moment where their religion of sin is apotheosized into this new religion. And that's really the thing that carries on all of the things, the priestly, otherworldly values that Nietzsche criticized. So, but, it is a profound insight that it reminds me of one of the aphorisms from last week, actually. The Christian determination to find the world ugly and bad has made the world ugly and bad. So the Christian belief that sin is the worst form of suffering has made sin the worst form of suffering. Let's go to 139. Quote, "The color of the passions. People like St. Paul have an evil eye for the passions. All they know of the passions is what is dirty, disfiguring, and heartbreaking. Hence their idealistic tendency aims at the annihilation of the passions. They find perfect purity in the divine. Very differently from St. Paul and the Jews, the Greeks directed their idealistic tendency precisely toward the passions, and loved, elevated, gilded, and deified them. Evidently, passion made them feel not only happier, but also purer and more divine. And the Christians, did they want to become Jews in this respect? Did they, perhaps, succeed?" End quote. In light of much of the exegesis we've already done, this passage is straightforward. What Nietzsche focuses on here is the way that these two very different value systems regard the passions. Nietzsche hasn't yet drawn up his etymological analysis of why this is, why the Christian valuations are antithetical to the Greek, but we have it there. The Greeks love and elevate their passions. They even deify them. We could also cross-reference this passage with Nietzsche's claim in Daybreak that the Greeks held festivals from time to time for their all-too-human, those base instincts that had to be allowed to flare up, even if you contained them in a ritual context. So the Greeks viewed everything that transcended the power of man to be akin to a god. Any force that operates independently of the human will is, in a totally personified world, that's a god. That's the nature of their polytheism. That doesn't mean it's benevolent or that it required your worship or that it's like a moral tutor, all of these ideas we glom on to God today. But for those gods which man had to deal with, it was best to propitiate them. And among the gods that had to be propitiated were those who caused emotional states. So Cupid brings about lust, rage is brought about by Ares, and so on. And the Greeks had a kind of reverence for the passions, even if they weren't always good. I mean, even love, in this case meaning like sexual desire, it's a very dangerous passion. The Greeks actually probably considered more passions to be dangerous than we would, but they didn't believe in emasculating them. St. Paul, on the other hand, is very much opposed to the passions, or it's again that approach of extirpation or emasculation. In his letters, the main form that sin takes, or the main way that he describes sin, is following one's impulses, or following the flesh against the spirit. Now, remember the passage is called the color of the passions, so we might ask, what color or what light does each respective ideology throw onto the passionate side of human life? Both interpretations, Nietzsche makes it clear, are idealistic in a way, because he says the Greeks directed their idealistic tendency in a different way, to create happiness for themselves, make themselves feel purer and more divine. The Christian worldview uses the idealistic tendency to project their happiness into the other world. And their fixation in the here and now, their focus in the here and now, where their attention is going is on that emasculation method. And did the Christians want to become Jews in this respect? Did they succeed? Did they adopt a priestly ascetic value system? Nietzsche would say yes on all counts. And, I should note that I don't think Nietzsche is entirely right about this, at least insofar as the Jews are totally anti-passionate. There's an old Jewish idea of like the wayward inclination and the sort of righteous inclination that we both have. And they're both good in a way because God put them there, not because you should break, your religious observances in pursuit of your passions, but that to have passion is good, even if the point is to overcome it. There is a little bit more humanity, a little more wiggle room than he presents, but maybe not with St. Paul. I mean, who again is that? He is Jewish ethnically, but he's literally the person who's legislating the apotheosis of sin, as we're sort of identifying it here. And again, I hate to bring up that Philosophy Tube video again, but the way the Jews are associated with the priestly ideal, I could see somebody, I'm just running it over in my head, and this is why I want to respond to it, because I want to respond to Abigail Thorne again, but because I could see somebody saying, this is a contradiction, and I do want to address it. This passage is actually a great example of why the priest is not a synonym for Jewish in Nietzsche's work, which is one of the points I responded to in that video. And I could see someone saying, Nietzsche sure is associating the priestly with the Jewish, right? And he clearly associates the two, but this makes it clear he's pointing to a transhistorical phenomenon of the priestly ideal, which is transmuted out of the Jewish religion into the Christian. And I guess I've already kind of made that apologia, but one helpful passage that comes to mind that I brought up in that video is when he says in Will to Power, what's called Semitic, in other words, what's called Jewish, is merely priestly. They learned the priestly ideal in Babylon. The pattern, Nietzsche says, comes from the Aryan world. So, meaning at that time, Central Asia. So, when he says here the Christians perhaps became Jews in this respect, it's actually very helpful for understanding that, right? Of why it's not, to say priestly is not code for Jewish. because he doesn't mean they literally became Jews. He doesn't mean they literally became ethnically Jewish. That's not what the signifier, priestly, is referring to. Obviously, he's using the term Jewish here to indicate the priestly ideal, but this passage shows it doesn't literally equate to Jewish people, because he's showing here how the same ideal becomes Christian and becomes 100 times purer and more extreme and more excessive in the Christians, that whole priestly ideal, than it ever was in Judaism. And I mean, just as a final note, it's another thing I brought up in the video. The reason why he does this is in Germany at the time, there's a trend among the anti-Semites of portraying Christianity as a completely separate religion, or even as an Aryan religion, suggesting that Jesus was an Aryan, and trying to disconnect the Christian religion from Judaism. And in that context, that backdrop, that's where Nietzsche connects the two. And I would say it's fairly commonplace now to make that observation, that Jesus Christ was Jewish, but in Nietzsche's time, there would have been people who actually denied this. And there was a very, you might say there was a need to advocate for the position that one can see the genealogy of the values of Christianity. You can see that genealogy coming from the Jewish world in the morality of the religion. And that, in fact, there's a passage in the Antichrist where Nietzsche says that Jesus and Paul are the most Jewish Jews who ever lived. But he also says that he's a more noble person than his Christian followers, that he's this rare, extraordinary type of individual. And what does Nietzsche say? He said if he had lived a bit longer, he would have repudiated his earlier teaching. He says that about Jesus, right? That he was noble enough for that. But the types that Christianity appealed to were the types Nietzsche called the strong but botched men, people with an instinct for cruelty, but with nowhere for that cruelty to go. That's who really takes on the religion. So that's who the followers are, who spread the religion. And I mean, who does that sound like? Hard, cruel northerners who are also botched, who are not well turned out. He's kind of talking about Germans. You guys are the ones who ruined it, right? This product of a noble mind. It wasn't appropriate for you in some sense. So this interpretation's a real rejection of the anti-Semitic position at the time, for one, that you get this religion from the Jews. Nietzsche also says, in some sense, you're not even really worthy of it. There's only one Christian, and he died on the cross. But the broader point here is that whenever Nietzsche is talking about the priestly ideal, it does not equate to Jewish because it becomes Christian. It transforms into something else. The historical Jews, the ethnic Jews that are around today, are not the people Nietzsche's talking about when he's talking about the priests in the modern day. And, looking at this, it's probably a good thing I did all that contextualizing, because we have some very unwoke passages coming up, so brace yourself. 140, quote, "Too Jewish. If God wished to become an object of love, he should have given up judging and justice first of all. A judge, even a merciful judge, is no object of love. The founder of Christianity was not refined enough in his feelings at this point, being a Jew," end quote. What this passage makes me think of, so again, somebody in modern times would never write a passage like that. So, I understand getting offended at it, literally saying, too Jewish, right? There's something very crass about it from our perspective. But, okay, what this makes me think of is Schopenhauer's comment on the Old Testament versus the New Testament. And I went ahead and found an excerpt from his essays where he talks about this. Quote, "For the Old Testament places man under dominion of the law, which law, however, does not lead to redemption. The New Testament, on the other hand, declares that the law is insufficient and indeed absolves man from obedience to it. In its place, it preaches the kingdom of grace, which one can enter through faith, charity, and total denial of self. This is, it says, the road to redemption from evil and from the world," end quote. I think this brings out exactly what Nietzsche means here, and that the Christian story, by combining the canons of the Old and New Testament into a dual canon, is the story of a wrathful, judgmental God, that God who enjoys revenge and is so powerful that nothing can hurt him, and demands we abide by his rules because not to do so is to impugn his honor, who then embodies himself as a human being and preaches a gospel of love, and is a total pacifist who lets himself be martyred. And the cognitive dissonance that's caused by perceiving that difference between the Old Testament binding of people under the law and the New Testament portrayal of God as forgiveness and love has led people to some pretty creative interpretations of Scripture. I mean, I just recently talked to Gnostic informant. We had a great conversation, but in any case, I immediately think of the Gnostics, the one who posited the idea of the demiurge, of an evil creator, who they associated with Yahweh. And they, some of them at least, put forward the idea that Christ was the son of a different God, like a higher divinity, a true divinity that wants to liberate mankind from what is effectively a spiritual prison that Yahweh has placed us in. And that's just one example of people sort of like trying to grapple with that cognitive dissonance between the difference between these two figures that are both God, Yahweh and Jesus. And so we discussed earlier that, the regime of law of the Jewish religion, of the observance of these behaviors and taboos and prohibitions, that's the old priestly model. Jesus innovates. He creates this regime based on forgiveness of sin out of a love for mankind. But Nietzsche says that a judge, even a merciful judge, is not an object of love. So the founder of Christianity, if he was truly refined in his sense for this, would have dispensed with judging and justice altogether, which is a very interesting idea. Some could say that that's almost what Nietzsche does, is he takes that Christian forgiveness, and I have made this point before, unconditionally forgives the world, whereas the forgiveness of Christianity is conditional, so that backdrop of judgment is still there. And, I don't know. In spite of what Schopenhauer says, even though he's, again, directionally correct in identifying this sort of like fundamentally different character of New Testament versus Old Testament, he also oversimplifies the matter as well. There are complications here because Jesus says, I come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. So, which I guess does bolster Nietzsche's point that the Christian religion is not totally this hippie, free, free forgiveness for everyone type of religion as it is sometimes portrayed. The backdrop of judgment is always there. Let's go to 141, quote, "To Oriental, what? A God who loves men, provided only that they believe in him, and who casts an evil eye and threats upon anyone who does not believe in this love. What? A love encapsulated in if clauses, attributed to an almighty God. A love that has not even mastered the feelings of honor and vindictiveness. How Oriental this is. If I love you, is that your concern? Is a sufficient critique of the whole of Christianity," end quote. I think Oriental here we can take in the classical sense. Let's say a Latin writer would use that term, referring really to despotism. That, like, we here in the West have like republican systems of governance, which they understood to exist even during the time up to the Principate period of the Roman Empire. And the Romans don't really come to grips with the idea that having an emperor has done away with that, because there's still like the pretenses of having a republican system, and maybe even some sort of, at least like cultural desire to respect the old institutions of the Senate and the republican life. In any case, that lingers for a very long time. It's not until Diocletian that the Romans basically adopt the quote-unquote Oriental model. And that was how contemporaries, critics, criticized Diocletian. But, anyway, these people in the East and, Persians and so on, they have these god kings. They're totally autocratic and unquestionable. And I'm sure from Nietzsche's study of China, you'd probably say this applies there as well. In China, the emperor is the son of heaven. And this is the kind of ruler who expects his love to be returned, or else he'll revenge himself upon you. And it's a kind of love that has not mastered feelings of honor and vindictiveness, as Nietzsche puts it here. So these qualities to be mastered are mastered by love. So there's like another sort of contradiction here, and an indication that Nietzsche thinks a genuine physiological love sort of transcends these kinds of responses or reprisals based on, having to revenge yourself upon someone who insults your honor. And his counterexample is to quote Goethe from his Dichtung und Wahrheit, which is Goethe's autobiography, quote, "If I love you, is that your concern?" And Goethe was actually paraphrasing a philosopher whom he loved very much, and whom Nietzsche also loved very much, Spinoza. And this comes from Goethe's discussion of Spinoza's assertion in his Ethica, quote, Whoever loves God must not expect God to love him in return, end quote. And so Nietzsche he's quite simply, again, pointing to the conditional forgiveness of God's love here, the way that God is portrayed in the Bible, and how true love, in fact, is always unconditional. It's not a feeling that you voluntarily adopt and place terms and limits on. It's a drive. It's uncontrollable. You can't choose not to love someone or to love them. You either love them or you don't. And to expect a response from them or else you'll become angry or violent, right? Return my love. That almost proves that it isn't love. It almost has to be the case that someone's love for someone else is not that other person's quote-unquote concern, right? If I love you, is that your concern? Is it, right? You might hope that they love you back, but ultimately that has no bearing on whether you truly love them or not. And Spinoza says that's the way we should love God. And it's funny because the reason why Spinoza is even making that argument is because it seems logically necessary that Spinoza's God would not love you or would not wouldn't love anyone because Spinoza's God is impersonal. So Spinoza develops this idea that we should cultivate this intellectual love of God as it's really a form of liberation for ourselves, liberation from the sad passions. But this isn't with the condition that God love us back. So it's kind of, it's kind of the reverse, in a way, from Christianity. A man who has unconditional love for a God that doesn't necessarily love him back. And it's just worth noting. So the previous section, Nietzsche called Jesus too Jewish, right? Oh, not woke. For being too close to the Old Testament God, or not making that full break into the immanentist abolition of the law and total unconditional love. Here he criticizes Jesus, or even just the conception of the overall conception of God that develops after the New Testament. He criticizes Jesus as a God of love for being too Oriental. And the counterpoint is provided by Spinoza, who's a Jewish philosopher, through Goethe, a poet and classicist. So both sections, 140 and 141, are offensive, but it's funny that the first could be taken at face value. If you're not a careful reader, you could be like, whoa, anti-Jewish. But even in a very subtle way in the next passage, Nietzsche draws on the sentiments of a Jewish philosopher, and Nietzsche had already read Spinoza by this time. He knew what he was doing, for sure. So let's go to next section. This is 142. Quote, frankincense. Buddha says, do not flatter your benefactor. Repeat this saying in a Christian church. Right away, it clears the air of everything Christian, end quote. Okay, so first of all, it might be helpful to remember some of the things I've brought up about Buddhism on the podcast recently. So, Buddha acknowledges the existence of the devas, but didn't think that humans should worship them. Those are the benevolent gods in the Hindu world, or of the Brahmins. And he denied the existence of Brahma, or even of the Atman, the monistic substance, the selfhood of all existence. The core Buddhist teaching, or one of the core Buddhist teachings, is anatman, no self. So Buddha doesn't believe in essence. Buddhism doesn't believe in creator gods, even though there are very powerful beings who some worship, who might even be good-natured. But Buddha doesn't think they're worthy of worship. And furthermore, Buddha was also often called to teach powerful kings. And his teaching, at least as it's portrayed in the Pali Canon, which admittedly is a Buddhist document, but his teaching doesn't change when he's speaking to the king. He doesn't flatter them. He makes the same demands that they recognize their craving as the root of their suffering. And Buddhism has a long history of particularly in the Zen tradition, being able to speak truth to power, maybe even occasionally slap or humiliate a prince here or there. Now, some Christians have certainly spoken truth to power, definitely. But the difference, I think, is that in the Buddhist temple, one does not give things to an external higher power, a divine power. One doesn't give their praise to a divine power the way the Christian does, or entreat them in the same way. It's really the profoundly anti-worshipful attitude of the Buddhist religious character that's important here. So up to this point, in the text. Nietzsche's been talking about, we can call them contradictions. Really, it's just like cognitive dissonances in Christianity. A God just spontaneously of love and judgment. A God that's, you're called on to love, a God who loves unconditionally, and yet has conditions. A God that's wrathful and gloomy and sends a son that's a ray of happiness and forgiveness. And then in this passage called frankincense, I mean, that's a kind of incense used in the Catholic Church. It's actually one of the gifts that the three wise men bring to Jesus, frankincense and myrrh. So it's like a cleansing scent. And this sentiment, do not flatter your benefactor, in a similar way purifies the air. So all of that tension and torment of the soul created by this unhealthy relationship with this bipolar creator God, that's all cleared away in one fell swoop by Buddha's attitude. Don't flatter your benefactor. Don't feel obliged to return love. Don't regard the divinities as worthy of your worship. And for whatever the faults of Buddhism as a pessimistic religion, there's a reason why, in the Antichrist, Nietzsche says it's 100 times more logical than Christianity. And it is overall a superior religion. And as another note here, if you're wondering about the source of the quote, Nietzsche seems to have gotten it from Emerson, from the essay entitled Gifts. He says the Buddhists whom he admires never say thank you, and that there's a Buddhist saying, do not flatter your benefactors. Nietzsche, in his copy of Emerson, underlined this passage. But I don't think this quote actually comes from the Buddha, although it could be, maybe it's a paraphrase of something, or maybe something Emerson heard a Buddhist say, right? Now, in this next section, Nietzsche pivots to talking about the Greek gods. So we spent all this time talking about Judaism and Christianity, occasionally bringing in the comparison to the Greeks, but again, using those comparisons with Greece to talk about what is Christian, to expose what is Christian. So it's an interesting structural thing for the work. Nietzsche then clears the air, cleanses the air with some frankincense, before moving on to say, now let's talk about the Greek religion, which is cleaner. We kind of purify ourselves after talking about all this dirty Christianity. Now we're going to talk about the Greeks. So this is 143, quote, "The greatest advantage of polytheism, for an individual to posit his own ideal and to derive from it his own law, joys, and rights, that may well have been considered hitherto as the most outrageous human aberration and as idolatry itself. The few who dared as much always felt the need to apologize to themselves, usually by saying, 'It wasn't I, not I, but a God through me.' The wonderful art and gift of creating gods, polytheism, was the medium through which this impulse could discharge, purify, perfect, and ennoble itself. For originally, it was a very undistinguished impulse, related to stubbornness, disobedience, and envy. Hostility against this impulse to have an ideal of one's own was formerly the central law of all morality. There was only one norm, man, and every people thought it possessed this one ultimate norm. But above and outside, in some distant overworld, one was permitted to behold a plurality of norms. One God was not considered a denial of another God, nor blasphemy against him. It was here that the luxury of individuals was first permitted. It was here that one first honored the rights of individuals. The invention of gods, heroes, and overmen of all kinds, as well as near men and undermen, dwarves, fairies, centaurs, demons, satyrs, and devils, was the inestimable preliminary exercise for the justification of the egoism and sovereignty of the individual. The freedom that one conceded to a god in his relation to other gods, one eventually also granted to oneself in relation to laws, customs, and neighbors. Monotheism, on the other hand, this rigid consequence of the doctrine of one normal human type, the faith in one normal God beside whom there are only pseudo-gods, was perhaps the greatest danger that has yet confronted humanity. It threatened us with the premature stagnation that, as far as we can see, most other species have long reached, for all of them believe in one normal type and ideal for their species, and they have translated the morality of mores definitively into their own flesh and blood. In polytheism, the free-spiriting and mini-spiriting of man attained its first preliminary form, the strength to create for ourselves our own new eyes, and ever again new eyes, that are even more our own. Hence man alone among all the animals has no eternal horizons and perspectives. End quote. So there's something essentially pluralistic about the Greeks, which, one way it's expressed is in the agon, the Greek competition, the contest between friends and rivals, really the same thing, friend and a rival. The contest to sort of outdo one another in all arenas, usually artistic or oratory or in politics. This pluralism is also reflected in the sophistic view. We talked about it in the episode on Thucydides and on the episodes on the sophists. The sophistic historian, as Nietzsche calls Thucydides, he doesn't superimpose an arbiter above human perspective. He allows the clashing of perspectives to rage in its tragic intensity. And I'm stealing a line from Mario Untersteiner there. But that's really what Nietzsche is referring to. There's this embrace of a multiplicity of perspectives in the Greek world. And not just perspectives, but like a variety of individuals, a diversity of personality and aptitudes and attitudes. And the evidence for that is that Nietzsche says the Greeks abominated autocracy. That's why their city-states were either oligarchic or democratic. But tyranny was always looked upon by ancient writers as like a terrible thing. It's ridiculed by almost all of them because the Greeks believe there's something really powerful that happens when multiple great talents are gathered together and kept in that state of competitive tension, rather than allowing one genius to dominate everything. And so this is true socially, it's true politically, but it's also, the pluralism appears in terms of their religion. And Nietzsche says in the unfinished essay, We Philologists, which was intended originally to be part of the Untimely Meditations, the Greeks produced the greatest wealth of geniuses as no nation before or since has ever produced, and the reasons for this should be studied. And in some of his essays, you could say he, quote unquote, studied this, but I think he wanted there to be like more serious study than his own sort of attempts at understanding it. But I think here he implies the religious belief, polytheism, had something to do with that polytheism by its very nature allows for a continual kind of competition between values. Even if there is like a consensus regarding certain overarching valuations, every cult represents a different ideal. Every cult not only has different gods, they have different interpretations of their gods. Many of the gods are called by the same names, right? And were later thought by syncretists to be the same gods. But I guess we might say, the gods of all the various spheres of life or of nature, each cult, depending on their focus and their values, can kind of value those gods differently or put them in a different relationship to each other, attribute different qualities to them, or virtues or vices to them. And what this allows for, Nietzsche hypothesizes here, and again, this is a hypothesis, it's a kind of experiment, albeit, it's an experiment based on Nietzsche's extensive knowledge of the Greek world. But he's still kind of getting into a Greek's head here, hypothetically, right? So he's venturing a psychological hypothesis that we could say, that to create such diverse and divergent religious ideals, the Greeks had to have a mental framework that allowed them to say, it's not me, it's a god. It's the muse speaking through me. And that's what gives me the right to put forward this ideal. That's what makes it more than mere idolatry. And we might recall Nietzsche's comments that each one of the great lawgivers, he mentions Plato and Muhammad, deceived themselves about what they were doing, the nature of their activity, that they concealed even from themselves, and especially to society at large, but even to themselves, that the act of revaluation was an I will, something that came from, it was their own artistic judgment in some way. It's their own drives imposing themselves tyrannically on the world. That there's a holy lie at the basis of that. And so perhaps we could make a further extrapolation. Maybe the more polytheistic you are, the more ordinary it might be for a new and different ideal to be put forward. But when you posit a monotheistic or a monistic ideal, that's the most powerful. It's also the most dangerous kind of ideal because it operates on that grand scale. It can become easily can become totalizing. So it requires that greatest power, it requires the greatest self-deception. And in fact, Nietzsche calls monotheism perhaps the greatest danger that has yet confronted humanity in this passage. So the great danger of it is that it's a recipe for stagnation, that it puts a stop to that process of consistently creating and reevaluating our ideals. And I mean, as soon as Europe embraced monotheism, what happens? We get the Dark Ages. We get 1,000 years of cultural retardation. And I mean that technically. I do not mean that as a slur or a derogatory term. I mean, again, stagnation, but like trying to reverse or slow the progression of culture, science, technology. And it's not until paganism is reinfused into the society, the renewed interest in the Greeks, a rediscovery of Greek texts, Greek styles of art and architecture and so on during the Renaissance, that Europe begins to stir a passion once again for scientific inquiry, leading to the Enlightenment, and a new beginning for philosophy and new possibilities for the civilization. So possibly by reintroducing the pagan, we reintroduce an undercurrent at least of polytheism. And Nietzsche says, quite in praise, that polytheism brings out the free-spiriting and mini-spiriting of mankind. And we all know what it is to be free-spirited if we're readers of Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's free spirit is unbounded primarily by moralistic and traditionalistic taboos in his thought, or he's not bound by modern prejudices or inherited ones. To be many-spirited, I think, is to be able to comprehend, to be sophistic in our orientation, comprehend multiple conflicting ideals without regarding them, like placing oneself as a judgment or a judge above them. To be able to balance contradictory values even within yourself. That's all cultivated under polytheism. And it's under these conditions that we can create for ourselves, what does he say, the most important line? New eyes, new ways of viewing the world. So we might think of the pre-Platonics here, figures like Anaximander, Heraclitus, Pythagoras, Anaxagoras, Democritus, yes, Socrates. New conceptions, new worldviews. The Greeks have a wealth of these new perspectives in this procession of genius philosophical minds. So consequently, they're able to cite new horizons for mankind. And I think that's one of the best arguments for Nietzsche, for interpreting Nietzsche's will to power as a multiplicity, as like a representation of a new sort of paganism. That the pluralistic view of reality, even if it's not polytheistic in the strict sense, in the old sense, lends itself to this like anti-Platonic, anti-Christian worldview, anti-monotheistic, anti-monist, and that we've been beneath the regime of that for so long that it almost would seem to represent a resurgence from an earlier age, an earlier way of valuing or thinking about the world. And this is yet another one of those passages that I think requires a side note, just about the development of Nietzsche's later thought. What does he say when he speaks of all the inventions of the individual imagination that were allowed under polytheism, and thus allowed for individualism to flourish and come into being? He speaks of all sorts of fantasy creatures, demons, centaurs, and satyrs, and what else? Overmen and undermen. To my knowledge, this is the only time Nietzsche uses the term Untermensch, which Kaufman translates as underman, but would normally be translated as subhuman. And it's also the first time he uses the term Ubermensch, which he would use many times, referring to a superhuman or overhuman. Now, in context, explicitly, he's referring to creations of the imagination, to ideals that are permitted under the polytheistic scheme. And so we might wonder, is the Ubermensch, in the sense he means, like the sense that he uses the term in Zarathustra, right? The Ubermensch, the next book that he writes, is that his attempt at crafting the ideal, the image of a god, in order to enter into competition with other ideals, aware of the fact that this Ubermensch will be one of many gods, and that it is a creation of his fantasy. And, remember, Nietzsche says this is the age of comparisons. There are advantages to this modern cosmopolitan age, including that modern people have a choice between more gods than ever, it seems, which functionally means more ideals than ever. And so in other words, is he revealing here that the Ubermensch is a creative invention, that he will mask as the inspiration of a god in the manner of the old Greek cults, or in this case, the inspiration of a prophet, Zarathustra? And does Nietzsche feel he can make this deception with a good conscience, knowing that that is how things have always been done? It's also worth noting that Nietzsche says that he who creates such figures also feels he has the freedom to reinterpret their own relation to laws, customs, and so on. So Nietzsche, clearly, I think he feels he has the freedom to do so, that that's what comes with creating this new image, this new ideal, is at bottom a new valuation. But there's just something interesting about it, and that he's acknowledging the fantastical, the imagined, the psychological origin of a concept that many people have argued over what it really means. And here he's sort of telling you what it means. Okay, let's go to 144, quote, "Religious wars. Religious war has signified the greatest progress of the masses hitherto, for it proves that the mass has begun to treat concepts with respect. Religious wars start only after more refined quarrels between sects have refined reason in general to the point where even the mob becomes subtle and takes trifles seriously, and actually considers it possible that the eternal salvation of the soul might hinge on small differences between concepts." End quote. This passage seems a bit tongue-in-cheek to me, especially at the end. But, sects really do take these small differences between concepts very seriously. I mean, one of the things Neil said in his conversation with me is that he used to go to a King James-only church, and they believed people who didn't read their version of the Bible, the King James, that they were going to hell. I remember reading this former Pentecostal. He said he went to a church that split, so they basically are like, we have to split into two churches. We don't agree, can't see eye to eye. And what was the issue? Over whether the communion cup should have a handle or not. So sects definitely split hairs in order to differentiate themselves. And again, there's that thing of proving that you're different from the others, establishing your exclusive possession to the truth, and so on. And religions, as they become more orthodox, in my humble opinion, seem to hate the heretics and the apostates more than they hate the unbelievers. And hate the other religions. Because in some way it's more infuriating when they're doing what you would perceive to be a distortion of your views. That's what they're putting forward, right? That's more infuriating than when you encounter someone who simply just doesn't believe in your ideas altogether. So people take these distinctions very, very seriously, and then things become violent. I mean, famously, the Protestant Reformation led to more than 100 years of serious warfare at different levels of intensity in different times and places. But even after the main hostilities are over, it's not as if the antipathy between the two groups is over with. I mean, the conflict between Catholic and Protestant still comes out to some extent. I mean, even in modern times, in the tension between England and Ireland. I mean, that was decades ago, but in the grand scheme of things, it's really not that long ago. So that certainly that's a very real dynamic that Nietzsche's pointing to, but he's talking about it with this sort of again, kind of cheeky attitude, I feel like. And the passage reminds me of that one in Zarathustra. It's not a good cause that hollows the war. It's a good war that hollows the cause. So in other words, it's not a question of a just or unjust war. It's a question of a just or unjust cause, right? The cause is proved by whether or not you're willing to fight a war for it, because a cause that's actually worthwhile enough for you to fight for, to risk your life and limb for it, to treat that cause as an extension of your identity and treat it as an existential struggle to fight to impose that cause, that proves that it's a worthwhile cause. And really, this is why I'm not just being, I'm not just sort of being obtuse when people ask me what ideas I support, and I ask what they mean by support, which has happened. Because truly, I have no mental energy to give to quote-unquote supporting things that I don't actually support. I have no ability to affect. I'm not actually holding them up. I'm not actually part of the foundation of its support, right? There's no clear path for me to do anything about it, where like support just means thinking about it and coming to a position, like a yes or no, and like maybe caring about it really hard, but it doesn't affect reality in any way. It's just a talking point, or it's like part of your personality or something. I support X. It only really matters if you fight for the cause, right? That's when the rubber hits the road. So do you actually support this cause? If you're not willing to fight for it, right? Is it actually something you care about, or is it a pretense to caring about it? So it's almost not worth talking about those pseudo causes or lesser causes, the things that we quote unquote support without being willing to do anything about them. That's just sort of an aside. I guess what I'm just saying is that, so again, really what I'm just saying is war hollows the cause. The willingness to fight for something, the willingness to contend on the existential level, that reveals which causes are real and which ones are fake, right? Which are the ones that are empty talk or a virtue signal or something. So Nietzsche is an atheist who's been criticizing the Christian religion incessantly for most of these sections we've looked at today. But this is what an edgelord he is. He flips the script and says, but hey, I love their religious wars, man, right? That if they do anything right, it's the war. It's like war is hollowing the cause of religious sectarianism. It's that same hyper-rationalist struggle for purity or coherence that Nietzsche always criticizes. He never is like giving a praising word to these people parsing these little differences. But it's that actual commitment to fight and die for subtle distinctions in doctrine that means the religion's actually like educating the minds of mankind in general. It's educating them to be more subtle, to make finer distinctions. And being capable of that is at least an elevation. Now, there are finer distinctions over, which dogma of a life-denying religion you follow, and Nietzsche wishes we could overcome all of that. But nevertheless, it's an education for the mind, to compare and contrast and weigh these concepts in this way. And the point at which the populace goes to war over conceptual disagreements, that's precisely the point where they've learned to take the subtle art of drawing conceptual distinctions deadly seriously. So it's a good thing, right? It's an edgy remark, which probably shouldn't be taken literally, but there is a real point here. Remember the words of Heraclitus, war is the father of all and the king of all. Some it reveals to be slaves and some to be free men. We might add, or append to Heraclitus, it reveals some causes to be worthwhile and others to be empty talk, some to be hollowed and some to be hollow. Let's do a couple more sections before we wrap it up today. Let's go to 145. Quote, danger for vegetarians. A diet that consists predominantly of rice leads to the use of opium and narcotics, just as a diet that consists predominantly of potatoes leads to the use of liquor. But it also has subtler effects that include ways of thinking and feeling that have narcotic effects. This agrees with the fact that those who promote narcotic ways of thinking and feeling, like some Indian gurus, praise a diet that is entirely vegetarian and would like to impose that as a law upon the masses. In this way, they want to create and increase the need that they are in a position to satisfy, end quote. So, not much to say here. This is another passage about diet affecting the mind, which we've kind of already covered. And it's a point I kind of raised when analyzing that previous passage, that, vegetarian diet perhaps makes people more pessimistic in their values or become more otherworldly or turn to gurus. Kind of a repeat of what Nietzsche's already said. But he suggests explicitly here that there is a consciousness of it in some way, that the gurus would promote such a diet that would perpetuate the need for it would perpetuate a need only they can provide for. It would perpetuate the need for their counsel and their guidance over the pessimistic outlook on life. The strange claim, I suppose, is that Nietzsche thinks this diet leads to the use of narcotics, the way a potato diet leads to the use of liquor, right? I would say the reason why a potato diet leads to the use of liquor probably has to do with the fact that you can distill liquor with potatoes, right? But I can only think that he's referring to the use of opium in China, which has very little to do with their rice-based diet. We don't really need to get into Chinese history here and the involvement with the British and the Opium Wars and all of that. But maybe he's just saying only a people who was very pessimistic already would, fall victim to an opium addiction, or like that they're that way because of their diet that they would want to take opium. They want to check out. And with the potatoes and liquor connection here, obviously you would think of Russia and like Ireland. Is there an actual connection here? I'm not sure. Is there an actual point? I mean, again, the deep point is that physiology is the root of everything, and your worldview is something under far more influence from your diet and just the things you ingest and the conditions you're in and the normal experiences and sensations and just what you're taking in day to day. That's what's affecting your worldview. It's not the independent operation of the intellect. And that is a really deep and important point. Okay, let's move on to 146. Quote, German hopes. Let us not forget that names of peoples are usually abusive names. The Tartars, for example, are literally the dogs. That is what the Chinese called them. Germans originally meant heathen. That is what the Goths, after their conversion, called the great mass of their unbaptized kindred tribes, in accordance with their translation of the Septuagint, which uses for the heathen the word that in Greek means the nations, see ouphalos. It is not too late for the Germans to turn their abusive name into a name of honor by becoming the first unchristian nation in Europe. Schopenhauer gave them credit for having a very pronounced predisposition in that direction. That would be a way of fulfilling the words of Luther, who taught them to be un-Roman and to say, "Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise," end quote. Now, in the footnotes, Kaufmann includes Nietzsche's explanation of this passage to Peter Gast, his philological explanation of the claims made, that the Goth that Nietzsche mentions, Ouphalos, who translated the Bible into Gothic, used the Septuagint, the Bible in Greek, and he translated the word for nation, which in Greek is ethne, into the word for nation in Old German, which is also the root word of Deutsch, which is Theoda. But Nietzsche points out that the word used for nation also became the root word of heathen. So the words for Deutsch and the word for heathen come from the same Gothic root. So the broader philosophical point is that the Germans actually may be able to live up to their so-called despicable name, right? He's saying everyone gets these sort of names that disparage them, and the Germans are, you could see them as essentially the heathens. They could live up to that name if they become the first unchristian people, if they become the ones to throw off the yoke of Christianity. And given many of Nietzsche's comments about the Germans, which are always disparaging, it seems improbable to me that Nietzsche would think that that's a likely outcome. But, there is something subtle here that he's perhaps revealing. Nietzsche's maybe not so down on the Germans as he might sometimes lead us to believe. I mean, think about this. He writes in German, and he says himself that he criticizes those that he feels to have merit or are worthy of the criticism. So from a certain angle, you could see Nietzsche's critique of the Germans, often scathing, is nevertheless intended for their ears. It's intended to wake them from their Lutheran slumber and get them to embrace a thoroughly heathen and unchristian element of themselves. And speaking of Luther, the quotation from Luther at the end is from his statement at the Diet of Worms, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise," which in this context means, I will not recant my position, I will not retract what I've said unless you can refute me with scripture. And it's one of the most famous sort of like lines or quotable lines in the German language, right? It says the German, it's like stubbornness and intractability that Nietzsche often criticizes, like their hard-headedness, their pig-headedness. You could read that into it. And yet here he's sort of, he's conjuring their stubbornness as like a virtue. He's saying if they were to commit to slaking off Christianity, if this became a new implacable desire, a new drive, a new thing to be stubborn about, then those same traits would become useful and they would become virtuous. They would be It would be a virtue of the Germans to be stubborn in that conviction, not a vice. Because that would make them the most appropriate people to reject Christianity. Maybe they could, in that timeline, lead Europe out of Christianity, maybe single-handedly. Maybe launch a new German Enlightenment, right, on a scale never before seen. Unfortunately, as Nietzsche feared, the Germans preferred to spend their energy militarily in the world wars, and we all know how that story goes. We don't need to talk about it. All right, one final aphorism today. Okay, so this is 147, quote, question and answer. What is it that savage tribes today accept first of all from Europeans? Liquor and Christianity, the European narcotics. And of what do they perish most quickly? Of the European narcotics. End quote. I think this is a perfect joke, a perfect setup and payoff in a way, or it has the structure of a joke. And no comment. It's self-explanatory. We're going to start flying through some of the later aphorisms in Book 3, because at this point in the text, they start to become truly aphoristic. They become epigrams. They get shorter and shorter. Literally, even in this next section, over the course of these next sections, they get shorter and shorter as we get closer and closer to the end of Book 3. So the last couple of episodes in Book 3 are going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be more rapid fire, like the way when we looked at Nietzsche's epigrams in Beyond Good and Evil. So it's sort of a shift to a different style yet again. But in any case, had a lot of fun today. Some really interesting aphorisms, some not as good, right? But just being honest about my personal feelings, that I differ with Nietzsche a lot on his insights here. But still, we can always draw something. There's so much there that you can always draw something interesting out of it. All right, everybody. Hope you'll join me next time. Cheers. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.